Independent film. It's a term that's thrown around a lot, but when it comes down to it, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different folk. Today, I'm going to attempt to explain independent film, what it is, and the different levels of it. I'm Jay Horton. I make movies that make money. This is how. In basic broad strokes, an independent film is exactly as Wikipedia defines it. An independent film, independent movie, indie film, or indie movie is a feature film or short that is produced outside the major film studio's system. Okay, well, seems simple enough, and in the past, that explanation was just fine. However, as the barriers to entry in independent film have gotten lower, equipment has gotten cheaper, and access to worldwide distribution has gotten easier, so many different levels of indie films have popped up over the last 10 years that if you ask any two filmmakers to define it, you'll most likely get wildly different answers. It also makes running channels like this one a constant challenge. If I say something like I just did above, that access to distribution for indie films has gotten much easier in the past decade, well, while that may be true for a certain budget level or type of indie film, it's not necessarily true for others. For example, if you have an indie film that's shot at like $50,000 or under, the access to distributors where you have a good shot at earning that money back and making a profit, that's pretty open. However, if you have a $750,000 independent film, the access to that type of distribution gets a little tougher. Or if I say something like FILMHUB is great for independent films, well, that's very true for lower budgeted stuff. But is FILMHUB ideal to release a $500,000 budgeted film with some notable name talent? Maybe not. It's just not an even playing field. The same rules of thumb and general guidelines don't apply the same to a $50,000 movie as they do to a $500,000 movie. Yet, both are in broad terms considered to be independent films. If I were to say that you don't need name talent anymore to make a profit with an indie film, or a hugely commercial genre to make a profit, well, that might be true for movies under 20K, some of the times, but at 500K, probably not. In order to make sense of this complicated tiered landscape, I've come up with labels based on budget level that I've assigned to help differentiate the levels of independent films. Now, this is not any official system, and again, if you ask other filmmakers about these terms, you're likely to get different answers as to what they mean. But this is how I see it. Lowest level, bargain basement, no budget films, aka backyard films. To me, a no budget film is a movie made between $0 and $5,000. Usually, cast and crew are donating their time or they're paid very little. Any money spent here usually goes to just simple hard costs. Food, camera, props, etc. And yes, I see the irony in labeling something no budget and then talking about a budget range, but in my opinion, there's no such thing as a truly no budget film. Nothing costs nothing. Cameras cost money, even if you already own it. Computers to edit cost money. If you're feeding your cast and crew, that costs some money. Your time is worth money. But I see this as a very low barrier to entry. And the indie distribution landscape is just littered with movies like this. Anyone who's spent any time watching Tubi TV can attest to that. And by and large, mainstream culture or, regular folk, they either ignore this level of movie or don't even know it exists. But that doesn't mean that these types of movies are any less of a viable business model than larger budget films. And while this is not a hard rule, successes at this level most often are from more niche projects. Most of the documentaries that I've made, they fall into this category. And the reason I'm able to profit off these very low budget films has little to do with their quality, which I do strive to make them really good, but it's more about the information or the stories contained within that a very niche audience of people crave. And they're willing to put up with slightly lower production values to get that information because it's just not being presented in more mainstream fare. There's also a market here for horror. There are people that truly love these down and dirty, cheapy movies. And while I think the number of people making them is starting to rival the number of fans, there's still opportunity here for hits. And, it's at this level of film that places like FilmHUB are absolutely ideal. The next level is micro budget films. I see these as indie films between $5,000 and $25,000. Many of my first films were at this level. And this is the level where not only were you getting streaming distribution, but like back in the day, you were starting to get DVD or Blu-ray distribution, which these days is kind of dwindling, but it's still there. Once you get over 5K, you're at the point where you can pay cast and crew something. You may be using some better gear. You can afford some low rates for locations. But at this budget, you're still below the level where, in my opinion, it's a good idea to go SAG. Sure, there are films this low and lower that do it. I mean, 10 years ago, a few of mine at this level were SAG and did very well. But is it a good idea today? Not in my opinion. Then the next level is ULB films, or ultra low budget films. I see these as movies between $25,000 and $100,000. This is the level at which I've directed the bulk of my narrative films. And this is where it starts to be maybe a little more prudent to think about SAG and getting some name talent. At this level, you most certainly should be using some better gear and crew. To me, this is the level where movies actually start looking like what regular people would actually consider movies. Better sound, better lights, better cameras, etc. Now, all that said, I have seen some horrible crap made for $100,000 that looks and sounds just awful. And I've seen some $5,000 stuff that blows it away. Budget does not necessarily equal quality, but in my opinion, if you make something for $5,000, you have way more of an excuse for lower production value than at 75. Once you get over $100,000 up to maybe $1 million, that's what I consider to be just like blanket low budget. I've made just one movie at this level. $250,000 was the budget. Though my follow-up to Craving, which I'm in the middle of finance planning now, might be a little bit over that. And that's pretty much it. Once you get over $1 million, in my opinion, you're in regular movie territory, regardless of whether it's an independent company doing it or not. I mean, hell, George Lucas independently produced the Star Wars prequels, and they were all $100 million budgets, but do you consider those to be independent films? I don't. And really, in today's day and age, there's very little like technical or quality difference between an independent film budgeted at $1 million and a studio low-budget film budgeted at $1 million. Now, in regards to this channel, I'm mostly talking about no-budget films up to about $100,000. Maybe a little bit in the low-budget range, $250,000 and whatnot. But most of the advice that I've spit here is geared towards movies under $100,000. While a lot of it is still applicable to budgets higher than that, I personally have little experience with budgets over $250,000. And one of the things I pride myself most on this channel is that I speak from experience. Actual real world experience, and a ton of it. And unlike some bigger popular filmmaking YouTube channels, I actually made a lot of real, in the world, earning money feature films. And in my opinion, it makes this channel worth doing and worth listening to. So if you haven't dug in, check out my distribution playlist here. But whatever you do, keep making movies.